Next slide after that. This is the first time we have done a virtual community budget workshop, and traditionally we provide 2 workshops on both the western and eastern parts of the city. Due to COVID-19 and closure of our library facilities and social distancing requirements for the council chambers, we are using this platform to do our outreach to the community. We would like to thank the City Clerk's Office, Information Technology Department, and the Administration Department for assisting us to provide this presentation. Displayed is our agenda for tonight's presentation. We will go over the All Fund Summary, General Fund Summary, Measure A Sales Tax Fund Summary, and Measure P Sales Tax Fund Summary. We will then go over the fiscal year 21 capital improvement program, and then finally the next steps in our budget development process. At this point, I would like to introduce Mr. David Bilby, our Director of Finance, to provide introductory remarks, and then we will start our presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us tonight. We have a lot of information for you, and we hope that this will still be interactive as we do enjoy having conversations and dialogue with our public about budget priorities and what our next steps are. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ed and Bob.
Thank you, David. So this is Ed Prindell again, and I'll be discussing the changes between the fiscal year. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. And we'll be discussing the changes between the fiscal year 2020 adopted budget and the fiscal year 21 proposed budget. The fiscal year 21 budget projections and assumptions were prepared in early March 2020, prior to the economic decline due to the COVID-19 crisis. Updated projections and recommended changes to the budget will be brought back for council consideration early in the first quarter of fiscal year 2021, when more data is available. The city currently has over 150 different funds that makes up the city of Chula Vista's budget. This presentation will concentrate primarily on the general fund, which is used to pay for the day-to-day operations of the city, including police, fire, parks and recreation, library, and other related departments. It's important to mention that the proposed budget is an estimate and staff is still finalizing the numbers that will be part of the city manager's fiscal year 21 proposed budget that will be presented to the city council on Tuesday, May 26. This slide represents all budgeted funds. The fiscal year 20 adopted budget revenues exceeded expenditures, resulting in a surplus of $3 million. The fiscal year 21 proposed budget revenues exceed expenses by a total of $2.2 million. For fiscal year 21, which is an overall change of $0.8 million. Unless there's any questions, we'll proceed to the next slide. The all funds revenue for fiscal year 21 proposed budget increased by $13.1 million compared to the fiscal year 20 adopted budget. Some of the numbers are inflated due to the fact that funds received in one fund and transferred to another fund is double counted on this slide. For example, Measure A and Measure P sales taxes are both collected in the general fund and then is transferred to their own respective funds. Both the revenues received by the general fund and the revenues received by both Measure A and Measure P funds are counted in this schedule, thus inflating the actual numbers. We will just focus on the significant revenue changes, starting with the property taxes category. Oh, previous slide, sorry. That increased by $2.4 million. $1.2 million is for property taxes, and another $1.2 million is related to the motor vehicle license fee revenues that are tied directly to assessed values of property within the city. The next significant change is the $7.5 million increase of other local taxes, which accounts primarily for the following revenues. $1.8 million increase of sales taxes, $1.75 million increase of Measure A and Measure P sales tax each. Other agency revenues increased by $1 million. This is for a $0.5 million increase for gas tax revenues based upon the February estimates prior to COVID-19, and another $0.5 million from reimbursements from other governmental agencies. Charges for service increased by $1.7 million that are fees charged for services provided for capital and development related projects. Lastly, transfers from other funds decreased by $0.5 million due to a decline of grant revenues. If there's no questions, we'll proceed to the next slide. Thank you. This slide represents all fund expenses by budget category. Personnel services increased by $5.3 million when comparing the fiscal year 20 adopted budget to the fiscal year 21 proposed budget. The primary contributor is the addition of 23 new positions for both the fire department and police department for the Measure A fund to fund public safety related positions. The salary savings increased by $1.2 million compared to the previous fiscal year. Retirement benefits increased by $2.8 million, which is primarily tied to the increase of the unfunded actuarial liability, or UAL. Health insurance costs increased by $0.9 million for a total personnel increase of $7.8 million for all funds. Supplies and services increase of $7.5 million is due to an increase in sewage processing costs of $3.7 million in the sewer fund, and removal of a negative $2.5 million supplies and services savings appropriation from fiscal year 20 that used fiscal year 19 encumbrances that was carried forward into fiscal year 20 in the general fund. I know that's a lot. Other expenses decreased by $2.8 million for debt-related expenses. Capital increase of $1.5 million is tied to vehicle purchases for the Measure P sales tax fund. Transfer outs increased by $4.1 million for the general fund to the Measure A and Measure P sales tax fund for $3.5 million combined. The Bay Fund commitment of $1.6 million is also included in the transfer outs, and the reduction of a PIF-DIF loan repayment of $1.5 million that will be made in fiscal year 20 has been removed. CIP project expenditures decreased by $4.9 million. Overall, the all funds expense increased by $14 million. If there's no questions, we'll proceed to the next slide. Thank you. We have taken 150 plus funds and grouped them into the categories that are presented on this slide for illustrative purposes only. So overall, the revenues have decreased. Revenues are $403 million. Expenses are $401 million with a net impact of $2.1 million. There's no questions. Proceed to the next slide, please. This slide represents all funds budgeted revenues by fund type. The general fund makes up the largest fund, making up 51% of all revenues budgeted for the city, and then followed by development funds of 5%, Measure A and Measure P at 5% each, and then open space funds for 5%. No questions? Next slide. And then this slide represents all funds budgeted expenses by fund type for showing that the general fund is the largest fund, making up 52% of all expenses, followed by the grant funds at 5%, Measure P sales tax at 5%, and enterprise funds at 4%. And the sewer funds at 11%, sorry. Next slide, please, if there's no questions. So going over the general fund summary, the general fund baseline budget projections and assumptions were prepared in early March 2020, prior to the economic decline due to the COVID-19 crisis. Updated projections and recommended changes to the budget will be brought back for council consideration early in the first quarter of fiscal year 21 when more data is available. Overall, the fiscal year 21 revenues and expenses were projected to increase by $10 million over the FY20 adopted budget. No questions. Next slide. General fund revenues were projected to increase by $10 million or 5.1%. We will discuss the remaining revenue assumptions on the following slides, but just wanted to mention that both property taxes and motor vehicle license fees increased by approximately $1.2 million each. The revenue categories that have the most sensitivity to our current economic environment are sales-related taxes, including Measure A and Measure P, in which, Measure P is reflected twice, but one should be Measure A. Apologize for that error. Transit occupancy taxes are also impacted by our current economic situation, and charges for services that are within the other revenues category is also potentially impacted. Property tax assessed values take a longer period of time to adjust for economic circumstances and changes, and staff is waiting, for economic circumstances and changes that may occur to the property taxes are currently being, we're waiting for the county to provide us an update on the potential impact of our current situation on our property tax revenues. If there's no questions, next slide. The FY20 major general fund revenues was projected to increase by $8.3 million, or 5.5% over the FY20 adopted budget. These assumptions, as noted on the slide, does not include economic impacts due to COVID-19. I'm sorry to continue to emphasize this point, but this is a very important point that I just wanted to convey, especially if people are participating in the presentation that wasn't at the very beginning. Sales tax, Measure A and Measure P were each projected to increase by approximately $1.8 million over the FY20 adopted budget, based on data from our sales tax consultant received in February. However, the preliminary estimates we received most recently are showing decreases in both the current and next fiscal year, which is 21, for all sales tax related revenues. Staff utilized conservative growth as assumptions for the other major revenue categories besides sales tax that range from 0.5% to 3% annualized growth. If there's no questions, next slide. The other revenue category increased by $1.7 million compared to fiscal year 20. This includes $1.7 million increase to the budget for staff time reimbursements from CIP and development-related activities, $1 million increase in cannabis excise taxes with the anticipation of legal cannabis-based businesses opening in fiscal year 21, a $0.4 million increase for business license taxes that is related to the council-approved fee increases to 7 Mile Casino that was approved in fiscal year 2019. As of today, 7 Mile Casino is currently closed and is anticipated to reopen when the governor's shelter-in-place order is lifted. And then a $1.4 million decrease of revenues for the PIF-DIF loan repayment to the general fund that will be repaid in the current fiscal year. If there's no questions, next slide. Overall, general fund expenditures increased by $10 million, or 5.1%. We will discuss the significant expenditure assumptions on the following slides. Next slide, please. Personnel-related activities increased overall by $2.1 million. Personnel service expenses increased by approximately $1.2 million, which includes 0% increase in COLAs, or cost of living adjustments. All labor MOU agreements have either expired or are scheduled to expire by the end of fiscal year 2020. The budget will be updated based upon any changes as a result of a new MOU agreements. Staff also increased the salary savings target by $1.5 million to help balance the budget, which is an overall increase of $1.1 million compared to the fiscal year 20 adopted budget. Flex insurance costs increased by approximately $0.5 million due to an increase in this year's insurance premiums. Pension rates for the unfunded actuarial liability, or UAL, increased for the general fund by $1.4 million, and our normal cost rates increased by $0.2 million for a total increase of $1.6 million for retirement benefits. Our normal cost contribution is lower since there are no COLA increases factored into the budget. Supplies and services increase of $2.5 million reflects the removal of the $2.5 million supplies and services savings that was used to balance the FY20 budget, which came from fiscal year 2019 savings. There's no questions. Next slide. Transfer outs increased by $5.4 million compared to the fiscal year 20 adopted budget. The original projections for both Measure A and Measure P reflects an increase of $1.7 million each. The Bayfront commitment in fiscal year 20 was originally budgeted under supplies and services, and as part of the mid-year budget adjustments done in February, reclassified that obligation as a transfer out to the new Chula Vista Bayfront Finance Authority Fund. The FY21 Bayfront commitment is the $1.6 million reflected on this slide. If there's no questions, next slide. This is a comparative analysis between fiscal year 20 adopted budget and the fiscal year 21 proposed budget for revenues and expenditures for the Measure A fund. Measure A funds are used to fund public safety staffing needs in the police and fire departments. Measure A total expenses increased by $5.1 million and revenues increased by $2 million compared to the prior fiscal year. The largest expense increase is personnel services of $4.7 million, which fund a total of 67 FTEs in fiscal year 21. If there's no questions, next slide. And then this is a comparative analysis between fiscal year 20 adopted budget and fiscal year 21 proposed budget for revenues and expenditures for the Measure P fund. The Measure P fund is used for the replacement of capital assets to address the city's deferred maintenance needs. This includes a total expense of $0.9 million change from the prior fiscal year and a total revenue increase of $1.8 million. The largest expense increase is other capital for the purchase and replacement of various city vehicles and equipment at $1.5 million. Total CIP project expenses are decreasing by $0.7 million and are consistent with the Measure P spending plan that was recently approved by the Measure P COC. At this point, this concludes my presentation, and unless there's any questions, I will hand it over to Mr. Bob Beeman to go over the city's fiscal year 21 capital improvement program budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Next slide. The CRP program for next fiscal year is proposed at $21.9 million. Next slide, please. This slide shows a breakdown of funding by asset management system. As indicated, over 67% will be spent on the roadway system, which is based on the type of funding we receive. There's also funding associated with buildings at over 13.5%, wastewater over 12%, and other categories such as drainage and parks. Next slide, please. This slide provides a breakdown by funding source. As I mentioned, most of the funding can only be spent on the roadway system, which includes Transnet, gas tax, and traffic signal funds, to name a few. There's also funding associated with Measure P and sewer. It's important to note that the city continues to seek grant funding each year. Next slide, please. Some of the major highlights for next fiscal year include programming over $11.8 million to complete pavement rehab projects on major and local streets to extend street life. The city will also be completing traffic signal modifications and upgrades citywide that focus on improving safety. There's funding of over $2.6 million also programmed to complete sewer-related projects throughout the city. Next slide. Some of the current projects include completing the third and final phase of the 3rd Avenue Streetscape project from F Street to E Street. This project is currently in construction. Construction has also started on fire stations 5 and 9. The total cost to design and construct these stations is estimated at $20 million, which is funded by Measure P. Station 5 will be relocated to 341 Orange Avenue. Station 9 is being relocated to 1095 Alpine Avenue, which is next to the South Library. The city received a state grant of $1 million to replace the current field at Lauterball Park. This field will be replaced with an artificial turf field to accommodate both softball and soccer. The lighting around the field will be replaced, and a boundary fence will also be installed. The city will also be completing sidewalk replacement at various locations throughout the city, and this project is funded by Measure P. Next slide. Some of the current projects in the design phase include the G Street pump station, which will be upgraded to provide sufficient emergency storage. This is the city's largest pump station, and it serves the Bayfront. Sewer capacity improvements are needed for the junction box at the intersection of J Street and Bay Boulevard. This junction box currently serves all the sewer flows for the city before discharging into the metro wastewater system. The intersection improvement project scope and locations were developed based on vehicle accident data provided by the police department to enhance safety at these top locations in the city. And the city also received a Highway Safety Improvement Program grant of over $2.3 million to install lead pedestrian intervals at interstations throughout the city to enhance safety. Next slide. This slide just shows a snapshot of the CIP program over the last 5 years. The top line shows the overall CIP, which normally ranges between $20 and $30 million each year. Except you can see there was a spike in fiscal year 18 due to the influx of Measure P funding, which allowed us to spend more on roadways, public buildings, drainage, and parks. As I mentioned, the CIP program for fiscal year 21 is $21.9 million. I will now hand it over to David.
Actually, I'll take over. Next slide, please. So the next steps in the budget development process are reflected on this slide. As part of the budget development process, staff will continue to make revisions to the budget numbers. Staff is working to assemble the city manager's proposed fiscal year 21 budget document and will be presenting the budget to the City Council on May 26. The City Council hearing and adoption of the budget will be scheduled for June 9th. And then in July, staff will bring forward recommended changes to the fiscal year 21 budget due to COVID-19 impacts on both revenues and expenses for all impacted funds. At this point, this concludes our presentation of the fiscal year 21 proposed budget. Staff is available to answer questions. Thank you. Next slide, please.
At this point, we can take questions. For those attending, you can use the Q&A feature to type in your message and send. We'll read it out loud and have one of the presenters answer. Okay, we have one question. The question is, so we won't really know anything until July when impacts of COVID-19 are included in projections?
This is David. We presented at council a few weeks ago what our preliminary estimates are for COVID-19 impacts. We have an idea that our transient occupancy taxes, our TOT hotel taxes, will be substantially affected for the months of March, April, and May. And then depending upon how quickly things open back up, there will be impacts in the near future as a result of a lower overall tourism anticipated. Sales taxes are also anticipated to go down. And what we presented to council in late April was an impact on the general fund of a little over $5 million this fiscal year. And then an effect to Measure P and Measure A as well, a little over $3 million there. So that's the information that we have right now based upon the best information available, but we have not received any data to support that current projection. So right now, these are all estimates and projection from staff.
Thank you for that. We don't have any questions at this moment, but I'll stay looking. Okay, is there a back of the envelope projection for the fiscal impact from COVID-19 on fiscal year 21?
We gave council a range of possibilities depending upon whether we see a significant opening in the economy beginning July 1 and a return to the activity that we had prior to COVID-19. And so we're currently estimating an impact of around $4 million going into fiscal year 2021 as a result of lower overall sales tax assumptions and lower overall hotel tax assumptions. But we feel like those numbers could get better or worse depending upon how soon and what phases the governor allows us to open back up and what are the impacts of the various federal funding programs for small businesses and for citizens and able to get additional help getting through this tough time.
Thank you for that. And the mayor also thanks you for this presentation. Okay, we have another question. When is it expected to begin to gain tax revenue from cannabis?
We're going through phase 2 of the cannabis review process, which does include looking at site-specific requirements and licensing with the state of California. So depending upon the timing of those specific phase steps, we believe that it could be middle of the next fiscal year or essentially fall to winter of 2020 for some of our first licenses to be able to be open in Chula Vista, but tenant improvements and other things outside of our control, could delay that process.
Another question, if the city has to cut expenses to make up for the lost revenues because of COVID-19, how will those cuts be prioritized? Does the city have a strategy of determining which programs or services will be the first to go?
Those are discussions that we will ultimately have with City Council in our early July budget review. So we do not have a specific plan that is available to the public yet that would define what our next steps are if expenditures need to be cut. We are looking at that internally and devising a multitude of possibilities for the council to select from, but at the end of the day, the policy decisions will ultimately fall back on council.
Sorry, Christina, my surface just froze up on me. Was there anything that I may have missed that I need to respond to?
I believe David has answered all the questions. Right now I have no outstanding questions. We'll wait a couple more minutes, allow people to use the Q&A feature.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have another question. With the additional solar that was installed, why do you foresee an increase in fiscal year 21 for the cost of utilities?
The increase to the cost of utilities is that our solar locations didn't cover all city facilities. And so we're anticipating increases. Utilities doesn't include just gas and electric, but also water usage, in which some of our open space areas, as well as for park and recreation areas, are anticipating an increase in rates for water fees or water rates for next fiscal year.
That concludes our presentation for tonight. Certainly, we appreciate everyone's contributions to tonight's meeting, and we look forward to the public workshop coming up on the 26th of May. Thank you so much.